Welcome to Second Sunday Forum, hosted by the Peace and Social Order Committee of West Falmouth Quaker Meeting in Falmouth, Mass. Today is December 11th, and we are recording, and it will be edited and posted with consent of the speaker as soon as possible. And today we have Susan Cozzens, a member of the East Side Meeting in Bellevue, Washington, and a professor emerita of the School of Public Policy at Georgia Tech. And she serves on the General Committee of Friends Committee and National Legislation and lives in downtown Redmond, Washington. She's going to speak on Reimagining Redmond 2022, What is Public Safety? And her talk last year was Reimagining Redmond, my personal project to understand and act on the ethical obligations of living in an affluent U.S. suburb. This year, she'll address the successes and failures of hers and others in efforts to address the structural racism built on policing in Redmond by creating a community that cares about delivering help rather than punishment. A question and answer period will follow, and we acknowledge that we are on Wampanoag land. Please welcome Susan Cozzens. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Erica, and thank you for the invitation back, friends. Zoom provides us with a few quiet moments at the beginning of any presentation while the presenter gets her PowerPoint up, and so I'm going to work on that, and you all can hold me in the light in that task. Now, with any luck, you are seeing Reimagining Redmond Part 2B in full screen. Erica, can you confirm?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for the invitation to come back again a year later. A lot has happened during the year in between these presentations, and I'm calling this Part 2B because I did Part 2 in August with the Quaker Institute for the Future Summer Research Seminar, but you're going to get a whole additional slice of the story in this presentation today. I'm just going to remind you where Redmond is, what it is, and why it is that that I'm doing this work that's worth sharing with you today. Redmond is, we're up in the northwest corner of the country. The red circle that just appeared shows where Redmond is in relation to Seattle, but here's a better picture of that. We're an eastern suburb of Seattle. Redmond's the kind of jigsaw puzzle piece that you see there, back a little bit from the edge of Lake Washington, which actually features in the story of the city. It's a very affluent suburb of Seattle. We were just chatting before the presentation started about the role that Redmond plays in actually national inequality because of the buildup of wealth there, because of the technology industry located there. Why Redmond? The first answer to that is just because I live there. That's why I am working on these issues in Redmond, but it's deeper than that. At the time of the George Floyd uprising, I was a relatively new resident of the city at that point, and I had started to get uncomfortable about the affluence and the comfort of the place, but really facing up to institutional and structural racism in the US while living in a place that's positioned the way Redmond is really drove me to a kind of moral imperative to do what I could to dismantle that racist system from where I live. So the why Redmond is a very deep answer for me. What I'm going to do today is very, very quickly recap some of the points that I made the last time about Redmond history, so you know a little bit more about kind of the soul of the place if you want. I'm going to talk about the beginning of this dismantling racism work, and then kind of midstream on that, my kind of deeper realization about what the methodology is that the Quaker Institute for the Future has been advocating. and then spend most of my time talking about ways that I've been engaged with the community in reimagining police in Redmond. So this quick review of some history. You'll probably remember that we were in the territory of the Duwamish people. We believe specifically the Sammamish band of the Duwamish people. We have an archaeological site that dates back 14,000 years, virtually to the end of the last ice age. And the indigenous people of this area are still with us, have been with the community, although very small in numbers at this point. And a native family, the children of a native family are in the picture at the top here. The father was working in the logging industry. The people moved across Lake Washington to be farmers initially, and they said, darn, there's all these trees out here. We can't farm really easily. And the loggers said, yes, trees, that's what we make our living with. So the logging industry came in, and after the trees had been basically all cut down, then the farmers were able to really get to work, but there were all these big stumps still there. And in the early 1900s, actually, Japanese families immigrated from a farming area in Japan and did a lot of the de-stumping of the land. They would lease an area, do the de-stumping, do some planting for a few years, get started. And then, of course, the value of the land had gone up. And so the white owners raised the rent enough that the Japanese farmers had to move on. But there's pretty good evidence that all of what's now downtown Bellevue was actually de-stumped by Japanese immigrants. The Historical Society doesn't talk very much about the silver shirts there in the picture to the left of the screen here, which was a white supremacist movement with its home in Redmond in the 20s. In addition to all that history of interactions on race, because we're on the east side of Lake Washington, we were cut off from Seattle for a long time until the bridges were put across the lake. This is the I-90 bridge, and that actually turned this entire area into a consciously designed white escape community from the terrors of the city on the other side of the bridge. So restrictive covenants are also part of our history. But in the 60s and 70s, the high technology industry started to move in, and we did become the home base of Microsoft. And Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos both have houses maybe 4 or 5 miles from where we are. So Microsoft brings, at least pre-COVID, brought a lot of people into Redmond during the day, in addition to the Redmond residents. So I've worried in this work about what does Redmond represent? You know why it's important to me, but I've been convinced by people I've talked to that there actually are a lot of affluent US suburbs out there that have histories that have resonances with that history of Redmond. And so the racism and racial disparity is built into the structure of the place. There's every place has a particular history, but there are these common themes, and the structural racism is very, very hard to address because the privilege is built into the environment. It is so comfortable. People love it. I love living in Redmond. I would just really like it to be different in many ways than it is. And the problems are a little on the abstract side, and they're very far away from the everyday lives of the people who actually make decisions in the city. So I hope it's a case study that resonates with some of you, and that you can all take lessons from. Because of this commitment that I made to look at institutional racism from and engaged with the community where I live, I identified a few issues that I might work on in that regard, including housing, schools, and police. And as I said, you're going to hear a lot about police today because way opened in that direction. But the housing in many ways is going to be even harder to take on. This picture is of a very nice new apartment development that's going up right across from one of our major shopping centers, and it's going to have a very high percentage of housing for middle income families and for low income families as well. It's well positioned in relation to public transportation. This is a wonderful thing to have going on. The housing community has organized and raised the money for it. The first floor is going to be a suite of services for groups that need special services in the community because of income, because of substance abuse issues, because of homelessness. So it's a wonderful thing, but it's only a part of the story for Redmond. So maybe next year housing. The police work that we got into is several of us from Eastside Quaker Meeting started in after the George Floyd uprising. We said, well, we don't know much about our local police. Maybe we should find out a little. We put together some questions. We met with the police chief. And part of what we discovered in that exploration was that there were very large racial disparities in arrests of various sorts in Redmond. So this chart shows some of the categories that are out there, and the disparity is expressed by the ratio between the percentage of arrests and the percentage of population in racial categories in Redmond. So the pattern that I'm showing here actually really focuses on the challenging interactions and caught in the system categories that one of my colleagues noticed. She works on school anti-racism issues. And she said, oh, those are the kinds of categories that if you're in the school environment, the Black kids get sent to the principal's office and the white kids just get a warning and they stay in class. Challenging interactions include trespassing, obstructing justice, vandalism, disorderly conduct, harassment. They're all areas where there's some discretion on the part of the officer about how they treat them. And caught in the system are when people are arrested because of court order violations or warrants. And some of those can be homeless people who've gotten a ticket before and were required to appear in court and couldn't keep track of when it was, or people with mental illness. So we are exploring some of that, but these are the kinds of numbers for Redmond that made us really committed to following through, finding out what's creating this difference in experience and engaging on it. So in the first stages of this, some other folks from Meeting introduced me to some of the activists from nearby communities, including a group that was working on school resource officers, which I have not followed through with much work on that because Redmond itself is part of that scene, is from what I can tell, is in a pretty good place, but I'm waiting to listen more to the voices of students of color. But one of the things that happened there was in the group of people that was working on that, there was one meeting in which they just kept referring to cops. And eventually that got through to me. And I said, look, friends, I'm really uncomfortable with the way we're using that word. And that made for some interesting back and forth. And the other Quaker in the group in the conversation said, oh yeah, I share that. And I learned some things about my attitudes that were coming out because they said, oh, it's not respectful enough. And I really wasn't intending to be doffing my cap to police. So I changed some of my terminology. And then that conversation just happened to go off in a different direction. It wasn't because of that interaction, but it is the kind of thing that I've heard other Quaker activists say that sometimes when they get into liberal and radical activist circles, that they run into things that they're not comfortable with as Quakers. Part of that connection was I started getting invited to some dinners that some of our nearby folks were having around how to respond to mental health crises. And I learned a lot about our shelter systems, about mental health issues at those dinners. Along the way there, however, I decided to go back and read kind of the original methodological book from the Quaker Institute for the Future to really try to get a handle on what the methodology was that we're using in the Quaker Institute for the Future. And I actually sent a note on March 30th last year to Gray Cox, who I know that some of you have met. He's done presentations for you, but sent a note to Gray saying, Gray, I got it. I got what the message is about this Quaker methodology, the QUIF methodology. So let me try and share what it was that I got. For a long time, I was the one symbol here is my scholarship and the other is my worship experience. I was kind of bringing issues that I was encountering in the scholarship into the worship experience once a week on Sunday mornings. And then gradually that connection got stronger and I started taking the things that I cared about from worship into the scholarship. And my scholarship took a definite turn toward issues of social justice as that incorporation happened. But the QUIF recognition was, oh, actually, the scholarship, the research can be worship itself. Now, what does that mean? The phrase participatory action research was being used, and I had seen it a lot as a social scientist, but it really took on some meaning for me at that particular moment. So in science, we have these methods that are based on a shared set of ground rules about what counts as knowledge. In worship, we create truth. We create the common spirit when we are together and when we share in the silence and have that covered sense of a meeting. So research can be worship when it centers in those same processes of learning and listening and then creating something together. So I've got this aha moment going on and almost immediately had an opportunity to apply that in Redmond. Just after that aha moment, I got a flyer in the mail from Redmond Police that there was new funding coming for public safety in Redmond, and they were having an open town hall to interact with the community around the plans for that. And I said, okay, I have to get off my tail. I need to get off my computer. I need to go meet some people at this meeting. And I did that. The levy is actually was a big thing for funding. It has to do with the oddities of tax codes in the state of Washington. They were basically making the case that Redmond's population had grown a lot and was projected to grow even more, and neither fire nor police staffing had kept up with that. So we needed this levy. The levy is an additional tax that was going to be put on property. As part of the very first plan that they had for this, they planned to hire one additional mental health professional. There is one person in the police department now who deals with mental health crises she goes out always with the police officer to do that. That's a model called co-response. And they were planning to hire a second person to do co-response. But what I found even at that first meeting is that instead of just one person, that city council had really insisted on there being 6 people dealing with mental health crises. And they had really set that expectation, and the police chief was completely on board. Why would that be? It turns out that the background story is what's reflected in the right-hand news story that you see here. In the fall of 2020, a woman in mental health crisis had called the police and said, please come over here. I've got a gun and I don't want to hurt anybody. And the police went. One officer on one side of the apartment calmed her down, and she put down the gun. She went out into the hallway to hand herself over to her former husband, who was on his way. And the police officers in the hallway thought she made a move in the wrong direction. They killed her. Her father was a former police officer himself. The family knew their options, even in their grief, and they filed for suit against the police department. And Redmond's insurance company paid the largest settlement that has ever been paid to forestall the civil suit going forward to the family of this woman who was killed. So the police department had to do something about how they dealt with people in mental health crisis. And that's where the commitment to additional resources, there was clearly an unspoken, but a pretty clear connection there. So we know that this money is coming. We, in collaboration with the folks who live outside Redmond, we were in touch with people on city council, and they really urged us from the public viewpoint to keep up the pressure to make sure that those resources stayed there. We put together a little fact sheet that was very popular, a little one-pager on the kind of program that we wanted to see. What we did was we made the case for a community responder program rather than what Redmond police were already doing, which was co-response. The difference is that community responders are a non-police response to three categories of crisis: mental health crisis, substance abuse, and homelessness. They're very highly trained for this, but they go out without police cars, not in police uniforms. This is a much less alarming response for the person who is called for help. And so it's really a safer, more effective route for developing long-term solutions for the people who called for help. And from the police viewpoint, we thought this had great benefits. Also, the places that have adopted these systems find that 20 to 40% of their 911 calls can actually be directed to the community responders, and so the police can get on with the business that the core business of police of preventing and solving crime. So we were making that case, and we continued to make that case with city council. As part of that, the folks from the nearby town connected me with another activist who lived in Redmond, Joy. She was a member of the community sounding board for the levy. It was wonderful getting to know the things that she does. She is very active in preventing homeless sweeps, not only on the east side, but in Seattle as well. And I learned that she is a police abolitionist, very deep commitment on that. And gradually I realized, oh, this is the same person that I had the disagreements with over terminology, over calling, over referring to the people who work in the police department as cops in this very denigratory way. And indeed, it turns out that Joy wears a pin, ACAB, an ACAB pin, and that stands for all cops are bastards. So there were some very deep differences that were there, but here we were working together on addressing issues around the safety levy. I had to go out and organize, which is tough for me. I'm retired in Redmond. I really don't know many people, but I got a couple people to come and make statements, very moving statements in front of city council. And one of our other East Side meeting members actually worked with the local Democrats from one of our districts to adopt a resolution supporting the community response model. A part of what I did during this time was I really wanted to meet the people who do the kind of direct social services that could be involved with this community responder program. And I started with this person. Her name is Susie Kroll. She is the mental health professional. You actually saw her back in one of those previous pictures, and the MHP here stands for mental health professional. I show you this picture of her. She doesn't use this picture anymore because she had been subject to ridicule on social media by some of the people that I was working with from these neighboring communities because of this picture. If you may be able to see let me see if I can outline it. This is a Photoshop that took out a thin blue line on her very police-like uniform that she was wearing. And the thin blue line says, "I stand with police." And this brought her into the line of verbal fire from some activists on the East Side. So the very first thing I wanted to do was meet Susie Kroll and talk to her and get to know her as an individual and a professional. And she is very impressive, she's very committed to co-response, which is what she does. But I got to know Susie Kroll. I also went and talked to Jim Whitney, who's the head of the medical services part of the fire department. These were the heroes that actually they were the first responders that picked up the first hotspot outbreak of COVID in the US, which was in the next community over from us. Very interesting kind of background stories. I met the head of the mobile integrated health program, which is in the fire department. And it took a while, but finally met our homeless outreach coordinator too, Tisa Rutherford. And I visited with our community court, which is a diversion program, to just get more of a feeling for what was going on inside this collection that Redmond calls Thrive. I was out and about enough at city council meetings, as well as meeting individuals, that I started getting greetings from the police chief and others when I saw them around the community. And at one of the city council meetings, I was sitting with Joy and I said, "Oh, I'm going to go over and say hello to Brian Coates. He's one of the deputy chiefs." And it's really nice to say hi because we've all got the same goals here. And Joy just looked at me and she said, "You do you, Susan." She would never have gone and just said hello. That's kind of where she is. Okay. So the work around the community responder program under the levy continued as the city council continued to deliberate on whether it would approve putting the levy on the ballot. It was really fascinating to hear that our language was being picked up. That little one pager I had done was being carried to meetings. They were really happy with the work that we were doing to support that, which was something they were committed to. Anyhow, as they got to the point of looking at a draft resolution to go from city council to authorize putting the levy on the ballot, we read it real carefully. We said, there's some problems here. The big one being that the way it was worded, they would never have been able to move the program out of the police department. Our position was that it shouldn't even start in the police department, but never being able to move it out would have been even worse. We actually engaged with the wording at a word by word level, and we were able to prevent that. At the same time, we then tried to move into making sure that the rest of the positions in the police department were not for commissioned armed police officers, and we failed on that utterly. In fact, that whole line of reasoning was kind of waved away, even by people who are otherwise very sympathetic. And I'm pretty sure that what was happening there was there are a lot of Democrats, and they didn't want to open themselves up in the electoral process to being soft on crime. And in the end, the council did approve putting the levy on the ballot, only 2 votes against it out of the 7 votes on the ballot. So then, you move on to the next stage. Okay, it's going on the ballot. Public safety levies pretty much always pass. So let's start talking about implementation. I met with the mayor to give her some suggestions, including to get an outside consultant to help consider organizational locations. Several of us met with a couple more city council members to talk about ways they might be able to use the budget process, which was the next big thing they were moving into, to move in the directions that we wanted. And then very wonderfully, Joy made the connection to East Side for All, which is a group that works on lifting up the voices of people of color on the East Side. And this is Debbie Lacey, who's the director of that, and Angelica Graham. And they then hosted a community forum on the question for this presentation: what is public safety? That was a great moment for me. It was certainly a different set of people than I had sat with earlier. And that's where I really got the point that when people just need help, the police department is the wrong place to call. So lots of nice work going on. Then a couple of things happened that were complete surprises. A couple of us from the Quaker meeting who'd been looking at those statistics kind of put them together, and we met with the police chief to talk about them. And the first thing he did was just dismiss them completely. He said, "Oh no, all this faulty analysis, anything compared to population percentages just doesn't make any sense. You have to look at people are at the like stage before, and depending on what question you're asking, that can make some sense." But at any rate, so that was like a shock to us. Those numbers had already started circulating. But the other thing that he did rather spontaneously in the room where we were meeting with him, he had the plan that they'd been outlining for the mental health program in the police department. And because that was something that we put a lot of work into trying to open up that question, that came as something of a surprise, including a consultant contract, which I talked to the mayor about, being narrowed down to, the consultant's just going to help us develop job descriptions for these positions in the police department. Then the next surprise was that the safety levy actually didn't pass. This was completely unexpected. I'd been out of town for a while and I came back. What do you mean the levy isn't passing? But the voters of Redmond didn't want any more taxes this year. And so all these new resources that we've been talking about to put into this very worthwhile thing were not there at all. It's a really different discussion trying to fit them into a rather tight budget. So Joy and I realized that this was a moment when we needed to speak up, and we both spoke at a council meeting, and I just put the case for, look, you've got to do this. You have to do this community response anyhow, even though you don't have the money from the levy. And Joy did a beautiful thing where she went through all the provisions from the budget of the things that they were cutting that were precisely the kinds of things that we needed to create a safe and healthy Redmond that didn't need police intervention. So we were kind of falling into this nice person, tough person division of labor, which I think is actually pretty good for us. And then when I found out that the police department was expecting this thing, I had a very heart-to-heart talk with one of the council members who completely heard me. It was honest. It was like everything was there, and she took it back to the council, and they put some resources into this very tight budget anyhow, including to have an outside consultant look at organizational location. So that particular move did not please the police chief. He and I had a kind of check-in meeting scheduled, and it ended up being 20 minutes of his upbraiding me for having been part of this action and being very defensive, and became really clear that he had actually planned on putting a co-response program into place. So just the very latest round, I expected to be turning back to the analysis of the data and all the things that we were doing to understand those racial disparities, and then came back from some other travel and discovered this in my inbox. On November 22nd, an employee of a coffee shop in Redmond had called 911 and asked for, there was a customer there who had asked for transportation to a mental health facility, and she asked for that from 911. Instead of a medical person showing up, a police officer showed up, treated the person as a suspect in a robbery that we think was as much as 3 weeks before that. Handcuffed the person. This is somebody who's declared himself to be in mental health crisis, right? Handcuffed him. He didn't get any help. Eventually, for some reason, they let him go, and he got on a bus and left, which is a scene that's been seen before. But he didn't get any help from having called 911. And the employee who was reporting this on social media was really outraged about it. So we have been working on a very firm email to get more information about this, and learned with some of our colleagues who are working on other anti-racism projects on the East Side that what we really feel strongly we want to do in this instance is not the right thing for them to be doing right now, and that's fine, because the relationship with the police department needs to be different in the different work. So what's next on all this? The work will definitely continue. I am turning back, and my colleague from meeting is turning back to the data on the racial disparities. I have been trying to get Redmond engaged with a learning community around equity in traffic patterns and traffic stops. Not 100% success there, but we'll see where that goes, because traffic stops are actually, the place where the residents of the U.S. meet police most often, by far and away the largest numbers. And there's a bunch of interactions that go there. Some of the police shootings are, of course, in these contexts, which is terrible, but there are lower level interactions, just giving a fine or requiring a repair to an old car from someone who needs that to get to work and doesn't have the money to get the repair, can set up a spiral that just ends up with families being torn apart. But because of the anger about the previous action that a coalition took, it's going to be harder working with the police on all that. But what both of us really feel is that it can't be just the two of us in Redmond. We really need a broader movement. And so I'm working my way out of my comfort zone to go and try and speak to religious congregations in the area, probably to set up a table on a Saturday saying Redmond Police Accountability, and trying to get people on an email list. It needs to be a movement. It can't be just a few individuals, because there's a lot of people who aren't sympathetic at all. And what we really need is a larger set of people, a real movement that has this alternative vision of public safety as providing help to people, and not thinking that we provide safety with the punishment responses like handcuffs. And then, of course, after I've got all that under control, I have to figure out the housing issues too. So back to the theme of research. If this is research, what are the results that I'm getting? That's a nice scientific question. So let me just remind you that the concept is that the research is worship, that at the center of it is listening and learning and creating community together. And so the personal connections, even the difficult conversations that I've had in the process of doing the work, have created connections. created a certain level of credibility. We learned that our neighboring community, people just aren't answering their emails. And to some extent, that's happening, that may be starting to happen in Redmond as well. But seeking people who are willing to listen can be really crucial. That conversation that I had with the city council member, in which it was no holds barred, but it wasn't conflictual. It was just very deeply honest. That is the kind of turning point moment that can really make a difference. The expectation is that we're going to be nasty to each other, unfortunately. And as you can see, there are people out there in my environment who have been nasty to people that I want to work with. But if we're really going to make this work, then love and respect really have to undermine that expectation on a continual basis. I'm just putting together what Christmas gift am I going to take over for Chief Lowe to wish him and his family happy holidays. And I also feel as though, just as in worship, like when we're in meeting for business and some conflict arises, the best thing to do is to settle into silence for a while. I feel that with these relationships as well, that we've had a little period of cooling off, not going to be helped by sending the email to the mayor tomorrow, but it's really when we can pull back and be quiet and together that we can keep the goal in view, and that is, in fact, a safe and healthy Redmond for everyone. So you may remember my closing prayer from last year, but recognizing where I fit in these patterns is something that I need to do every day. And I need to ask Creator to hold me in their hand so that I can do something that day to spread the benefits to others. And I do that. I wake up every morning, I say, okay, what's the anti-racism work I'm doing today? So thank you all very much for your attention. And I'll turn it back over to Erica to share. And I'm going to stop sharing so I can see you. There we go.
Thank you so much, Susan. There's a few questions in chat right now, and one is from Molly Cornell. Is the blue line on the uniform still part of the MHP uniform?
That's a good question. When she appears in public, she does not appear in the vest that you saw. That's probably a bulletproof vest. You could see she had a police walkie-talkie on, and she's figured out that this is not a good public persona for her. But I don't actually know whether when she does go out in the bulletproof vest, whether the blue line is still there. And of course, if you view that in a non-adversarial way, then you say, oh, all right, she works in the police department. She knows the police that she's working with. She knows that they're actually an embattled group. And so something that shows solidarity for people that you work with is not something that I would denigrate or ridicule her on social media over, not just from a functional viewpoint of I want to work with her, but also understanding where she's coming from.
Okay, and the next question is, what are the other communities that have been using the community response rather than, I think it's mispronounced, the co-response model?
There are quite a lot of them around the country. There are 8 programs that are really well known. I'm just going to name one in Eugene, Oregon, called Cahoots. And I named that one because it was actually Quakers who helped found that. It's like the grandparent of the programs. I think it started in the 80s. We have a directory of over 60 of them nationwide that are located outside police departments. We have one in the state of Washington also that actually does operate okay as community response inside the police department. The closest community to us is Kirkland, which is right next door. And they had a co-response program for a long time where one mental health or social work person goes out with a police officer in a police car, I think. Although another option is that the non-police people can go out and the police car can be not far behind. And so they've hired some people into it, and then all the implementation issues arise. Turns out one of these is an active duty military person who just got called up in the reserves, and so they were a little shocked to discover that they actually had an active duty military person. It's a long-term issue to work through. It's not at all a no-brainer, given the character of the political dialogue, to go with the community response model. But we know Quakers don't give up on issues just because they're long-term.
True. How would people in crisis contact community response if not on 911? I think there's a new number, isn't there? 899.
988 is a nationwide mandated suicide prevention line, and different places are. I think in many places are really scrambling to come up with something that happens that's appropriate when you call 988. We've got the rudiments in place of a system for that in the state of Washington, but there's a lot of work going on to get that, to get the response that we need there when that number gets to be widely known enough for people to call. Some of the other community responder programs have their own telephone number, and you have to do a lot of publicity and outreach around a community responder program to let people know that there's something else there. And we have a particular issue with Redmond because Redmond actually handles its own 911 calls. And so we still don't know whether that's going to make it easier to get the Redmond dispatch folks used to have operating with this broader category where community response is appropriate, or whether it's going to be harder because they report to the police department. And if the police chief is not convinced, which he's not, that community response will work, then they're going to pick up that attitude. So we'll see, but there's both 988 once it really gets working, and you can set up separate telephone numbers even if you don't trust your 911 dispatchers yet, but really working with the 911 dispatchers is what's needed in the long run.
Are there any other questions? Because there's nothing posted in chat. Sometimes people just like to speak directly.
Rod has one, and would you like me to try to get a link into the chat to our directory of 63 community response programs nationwide? I could try that.
Sure. Rod, what's the question? Unmute.
Curious whether you've considered the connection with the horrific rate of veteran suicide and the inability to integrate into local community where you go for help. And sometimes veterans organizations, especially Veterans for Peace, are pushing for treatment centered on moral injury. But that might not seem relevant, but there's some mental health problems connected to that in an ordinary community. But it's the number of GIs who go home and kill themselves speaks to the same creating a community in which there's respect and understanding.
Actually, that's a point that we should probably bring up more as we're trying to dodge the label of, soft-headed liberals or whatever. It is because veterans are way overrepresented among homeless populations. Obviously, the PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is something that so many of them carry, and that is a mental health situation. So thank you for that, Rod, to remind us that we should point to that set of people who are suffering. I have to say that it only recently has occurred to me what was happening in a story that I've told many times. I used to be an administrator at a university. And I've told this story when we were trying to convince members of Congress to drop the authorization for use of military force without congressional approval. At any rate, the story is that we had a graduate student in a master's program at this university, and he had been deployed in, I believe it was Iraq, 5 times. He had volunteered for a number of these deployments. He sent a note to his mother one morning that she read it, and she said, "Oh, there's something bad going on here." And she called the university police. The university police appeared at his house. He had the gun in his mouth. And when they appeared, he pulled the trigger. And I've told that story for the context of asking him to serve in wars that Congress never authorized. I never picked up the connection to the police arriving until I've been doing this work in Redmond, because I can now picture if that had been a social worker, having somebody in uniform arrive when you're reliving and having the nightmares that he was having would just have recreated the nightmare. So at any rate, thank you for reminding me of that group. That is certainly a group that would be helped with non-police response to crises.
And part of my orientation is that friends have taken on this anti-racism terminology to an extent where it would be better to speak more about dominance, anti-dominance, anti-empire, because the police to so many people are an agent of empire. I mean, the problem with so many GIs is that they wake up and they've been an agent of empire, of injustice, and they can't handle that moral dislocation, that moral injury. And they need real help in integrating their new understanding with how they can go forward, but the whole country needs this.
Yeah, on the one hand, if you can't name racism, you don't know what the work is about. On the other hand, looking for it's part of a larger pattern that we need terms to talk about. I can't quite see the Redmond City Council really resonating with it being identified as part of imperialist dominance. And I'm pretty sure the police department would recognize themselves with that, but I don't mean to. I know exactly what you're talking about, and just thank you for sharing that. And we're all engaged in this, in the ways to put the issues best together.
Perhaps one last question. Our police dispatcher asked straight, our police dispatcher asked straight off if there was a fight going on. And I guess they would want to know if there were weapons present.
Yeah, that's a good question. What they currently ask, the first thing they ask is this about fire? Is it fire, police, or medical? And they do an initial sorting out based on that. The criteria for sending community responders versus co-responders or just police include whether there's a weapon present. And that is why in these well-established programs, that less than 1% of the time, the community responders have had to call for police backup because the initial screening is very good and because they also know how to deal with weapons in many circumstances. So it's if you do the screening right, if the dispatchers know how to screen correctly, then the community responders are sent into the appropriate situations, and the police are sent into the appropriate situations. It's a lot of experience with it, like hundreds of thousands of calls that have been screened with less than 1% needing police backup. I'm sorry that I can't get the directory up because of the way the chat is set up here, but I'd be glad to send a copy of the directory to Erica, and she can then share it with anybody
Yeah, we can
here
share it
who'd
with
be
our
interested in it.
Okay, so thank you very, very much for the follow-up this year. And I'll be at Quaker Institute for the future next year and look forward to what you have to say. And we continue the talk. Thank you very, very much.